as a sign that one has been brought into the church. In other words, it isn't sacramental in a deeper, more traditional sense. That, if you like, salvation is actually actualized in the experience of baptism. So it's important, but it has lost some of the traditional sacramental character. And my fear is that there's a kind of reductionism at work there. Now, one of the other figures who I think for some reason these are not the writings of Dirk Phillips that are most commonly read, but there is a mystical stream, a mystical aspect of Dirk Phillips's writing, and he also applies that to the Lord's Supper, but he can't get himself to talk about a causal relationship, that it is actually in the supper itself, if you want to say in the elements itself or in the action of the supper, that Christ is made present. The furthest he can go is to say that they are coincident. In other words, at the same time as we take the bread, we receive Christ. But it seems to be not able to talk. What then? You have to be able to say something about the relationship of the elements to the presence of Christ. So he had a place for a sense of real presence, but couldn't talk further about it. Another comment I'd like to highlight in the middle of page 8. I have talked in this at a few points in the second paragraph about a rupturing of the sacrament's character, its sign character. And I wanted to highlight the closing sentence to that. To modern Mennonites trying to think comprehensively about sacraments within a Trinitarian frame of reference, this rupture is not the solution to the problem, but the problem of the solution. I talk then in the next pages about Pilgrim Marpeck, and I'm not going to go into that in detail. Simply to mention two things on page 9. One of them was that the spiritualists, of whom the most profound, one might say, was Caspar Schwenkfeld, he argued that the incarnation was an aberration on God's part. That for reasons known only to God, he condescended and Christ took on flesh, but in his resurrection and ascension, the realm of the flesh was left behind and superseded. And so Schwenkfeld argued very much that the truly spiritual Christian needed nothing physical. It's not the same as Quakerism, but you might say that Quakerism took a similar path. Now, Marpeck, therefore, is very strong in arguing that it's not an aberration, that Christ's aberration becomes the model for God's presence in the world. So that's an important assertion, as clear as it is anywhere in Anabaptism. Another thing that I worried about when I would compare Marpeck's listing of sacraments with my Catholic interlocutors' concerns was that there could only be a fixed number of sacraments, and 7. I've gradually become aware of the fact that in Orthodoxy, if I understand it right, there is not a fixed number of sacraments. And this was Marpeck's idea, that anything, that any action that made the gospel tangible in the world could be a sacrament. And the ones that were usually mentioned first were baptism, the breaking of bread, and foot washing. He had a very high place for the rite of foot washing. So that, I think, opens the conversation up more in this space than it would have if it's a conversation with Roman Catholics. Marpeck is very Trinitarian. I'll be interested to see whether we think that his Trinitarianism is adequate. And I've made a little summary of one way that he talks about it on page 10. About the middle of the page. In order to counter the spiritualist insistence that God works only outwardly, Marpeck talks about the simultaneous inward working of the Father as Spirit and the outward working of the Son as man. Does that sound familiar? Is that grounded in the larger tradition? I notice another similarity that I see particularly in the exchanges that Alex and I had that is widespread in Anabaptism. In fact, sometimes the Eucharist is called the ceremony or the ordinance of love. And Marpeck is very strong on that. In fact, he goes so far as to say, where there is no love, there cannot be communion, both with a small c and a capital C. One of the things that I find particularly important about Marpeck, in a fuller form than in other Anabaptists, is a holding together of dogma and discipleship. It has become very popular in both liberal and certain kinds of conservative Protestantism in this country to say that all that matters is Jesus the teacher. And that obviously is a profound part of his identity. But that making dogmatic statements about Jesus simply stands in the way of obeying him. I mean, I'm stating that as an extreme form, but I think it's fairly popular. And I think that discipleship and dogma are of a piece, and if you sacrifice one, before long you're going to sacrifice the other one. The debate that I get into, and I'll just flag this, this is a fairly technical point, but it was my attempt to relate it to the structure of Roman Catholic theology, and that is that as is common, well, this is one common formulation, that there is on the near the top of page 13, there is no mutual indwelling unless Christ is present. I'm summarizing things that I say elsewhere here. Unless Christ is present both in his humanity and his divinity. In other words, he's present in his humanity in that he uses incarnate forms to be communicated to us. That to have Christ in both of his natures present in the understanding that I've gained is almost the central point in Eucharistic theology, in Roman Catholic teaching. Is that also the case in Orthodoxy, or is the formulation quite different there?